Who is Athanasius? And why would a guy who lived 1900 years ago matter to us? Well, he wrote a book called On the Incarnation that I think will help us understand how our gospel that we preach today was the same one from way back then. We'll look at that in a moment. So before we get into the book, I thought I might share a little bit about why I liked Athanasius so much, and then we'll look at who Athanasius was and some of the context of his time. I remember reading this book not long ago, and I just really thought it was great to read about how Athanasius explained the gospel, how he explained what Jesus did, what God did to restore humanity, because it sounds very similar to the things that we would say in our churches today. And Athanasius lived, 1900 years ago or so, and so the way he explained things was very refreshing. I think a lot of times we have trouble connecting to the church, the early church, because it was so different. We practice church differently today. About everything we do is different. And so realizing that the gospel that we proclaim today is the same gospel that Athanasius would have proclaimed back in his day. So, who was Athanasius? Let's talk about him for a minute. Athanasius was born in the late 290s. He was born in Alexandria, Egypt. And Alexandria at this time was a great metropolis, one of the largest cities of the world at that time. It had lots of trade routes, lots of different people coming and going. It was known for all of its schools. It had the great library of Alexandria. And so it was just a lot of different people coming together and a lot of people with different ideas. It was a lot of philosophies were discussed, a lot of thinkers. And so this is where Athanasius was born, but he was born into a Christian family. He grew up, there's a funny story I read about Athanasius getting caught baptizing some of his friends when he was a kid. And so you can see from an early age, Athanasius had this love for the church and was interested in the things of the church. So it wasn't long after that, he was in his early 20s, he became a deacon to the Bishop of Alexandria. The bishop's name was Alexander of Alexandria, which is funny. But during this time, like I said, there's lots of ideas going on. It's important to remember this was also a time where the church was trying to figure out what church meant. They were trying to figure out what Christianity was and who Jesus was and how things worked. What made you a Christian? And so they were still ironing out a lot of these things. It was very early on. And there were other views that maybe were, I guess you would say the views had to be worked out. So one of the views was a guy named Arius, and his teaching later became known as Arianism. And Arianism had the idea that Jesus was not God. Jesus was created by God. And so there was a time when Jesus was not, they would say. And so Athanasius, on the other hand, would argue against Arianism, and he would say that God and Jesus were of the same substance as the words they came to use later. But they were one. They were the same. And so this, you could see the tension already forming. And the tension was growing in the churches. You would have bishops arguing with other bishops of different towns. And when this started to happen, Emperor Constantine got involved. He wanted to bring peace. And so he calls the Council of Nicaea in 325 to help the bishops come together and hopefully just work it out, right? And so at this time, Athanasius was a deacon, an assistant to the Bishop of Alexandria, so he got to go to the council. And he became known as an outspoken speaker, an arguer for this picture of doctrine. And he was only in his 20s at the time, but he had a lot to say, and people were listening to him. And so by the end of the Council of Nicaea, the Arian doctrine was considered heresy, and Arius was banished. And so after that, that didn't exactly end it. After that, things kept bubbling, and eventually Constantine relents and allows Arius and his teachings to spread again. And so Athanasius is still speaking against Arianism and was a main voice against that. Some would call him like the father of orthodoxy or a pillar of the church, things like this. It was very controversial, and eventually Athanasius was banished. And it's fascinating. I found it said he survived 16 different emperors. I don't know how he did that. And then he was banished 5 different times and then reinstated. And so you get this picture that for a while he's okay, and then he gets banished. Maybe a different emperor comes in that doesn't agree or something like that. But it shows the contentious times he lived in, but it also shows his influence. He was very influential, and the people in Alexandria really loved him. Athanasius was very popular amongst the people in Alexandria. And so the issue with Arian didn't quite get all figured out until after Athanasius. Many would say that he passed this mantle of fighting Arianism on to Basil of Caesarea. So that's kind of where we're at. That was some of the historical significance of the times that Athanasius lived in. Now, I want to kind of just give you an introduction to this book. The book's called On the Incarnation. What's fascinating to me is that the book was actually written before the Council of Nicaea. And so this book was not an argument against Arianism. It doesn't mention Arius, but it is Athanasius's ideas about the Incarnation and what it meant that Jesus came, that God sent, Jesus. And so I think that's interesting. And then before we get into the meat of the book, I have to mention the introduction. So the book was published later on, of course, a translation in English with C.S. Lewis writing the introduction. And this introduction has become a classic in its own right, and it's actually really, really good. But Lewis is arguing the benefit of just reading old books, as only Lewis could do. And he talks about how they've stood the test of time, but also how these authors from ancient times, they make mistakes just like we do, but they make different mistakes. And so it's good to read them, and hopefully it exposes the faults in our own thinking. So that's enough for introduction. Let's get into the book. So the book opens talking about creation. And it's an interesting point. Athanasius is talking about, he goes back to Genesis. He's talking about how we were created in the beginning. How only the person or the being that created us in the beginning could be the one to fix us, right? To renew us. He said Jesus assumed a human body only for this reason, the salvation of us men. He talks about how in creation we look and we can see all these differences as we look around our world. We see things that were created with different aspects. Those differences must have a cause, he would say, and that cause is God. Men are especially unique among creation because we are created in his image. However, our will could turn either way. Athanasius talks about how we had a choice and we could turn away from God. When we were created, we had place and we had a law. We were in the garden, and there were law. That we had certain things we couldn't do, right? But when we broke God's law, we lost knowledge of God, and we were in process of returning to non-existence. This is an interesting point that Athanasius talks about, how when we broke God's law, it's like we started to regress to the dust that we came from. We were going back toward non-existence, is the word he uses. So the problem that we have is that we were in this process of destruction, and the work of God was being undone. That's the problem, as Athanasius sees it. So what was to be done? Here's what Athanasius says. His part it was, and his alone, both to bring again the corruptible to incorruption, and to maintain for the Father his consistency of character with all. And this idea of how we had become corrupted, but we had to be made incorruptible again is a theme for Athanasius. And that's the work that God had to do. So for these reasons, he assumed a body capable of death. This is such a big point, and this is really one of the things that hit me so hard when I read this book. That just helps us understand the gospel. God had to assume a body capable of death in order that, though belonging to the Word who is above all, he might become in dying a sufficient exchange for all. In other words, God had to become a human body because he had to become something that could die. Have you ever thought about that? He had to become something that would die in order to overcome death. And then Athanasius says, thus by his own power he restored the whole nature of man. The Word assumed a human body expressly in order that he might offer it in sacrifice for other like bodies. So, here's what he did. He put an end to the law of death, and he made a new beginning of life for us. And this is where I see the correlations. That's the gospel. And I love that I'm reading a guy who lived 1900 years ago say the same things that we might say in our churches today. He put an end to the law of death, and he made a new beginning of life for us. Men had turned away from God and had turned to idols. So he talks about how men were looking at idols. They were in all this material things. Think about the Greek culture and all of the pleasures involved. And men were looking to that instead of looking to God. Men had turned from the contemplation of God above and were looking for him in the opposite direction. So it's like God was up there and men were looking everywhere but there. And so we have this conundrum. What's God going to do? And so God became a man so that he could relate to us. And this is where Athanasius talks about the paradox. Because God had to become a man. What happens? That was a huge point of discussion in this day. And so here's what Athanasius talks about. God's presence in the body didn't prevent him from being present elsewhere also. His body was for him not a limitation, but an instrument. It was an instrument he used. And here's a big point. I love this. He was not defiled by being in the body. That was a huge question of Athanasius' time because they looked at the body as being bad, right? Flesh, matter, all of that was like bad. And so God couldn't become a man, right? But Athanasius says, no, he was not defiled by being in the body. Rather, he was sanctifying the body by being part of it. And you see this, and this is my side note, you see this in the gospel where Jesus was no longer made unclean by things, right? Jesus made things clean. And so Athanasius is following up with that. And then we see proof from his actions. So Jesus, even though he was a man, he was still doing God things, right? He was doing miracles. He was casting out demons. He was doing things that man could not do. And Athanasius says, he was power and word of God veiled in a human body. And it was precisely to be able to die that Jesus took on a body. That was what we were just talking about. The point was to bring resurrection, so he had to be able to die. But this death, it couldn't be hidden away in secret, right? Otherwise, no one would know. Athanasius talks about how it had to be a public death that would provide proof for it, okay? And I thought this was an interesting point. He says his body was left whole, right? Jesus' body wasn't destroyed by the soldiers. It was left whole and undivided. And Athanasius sees that as a testimony against those who would divide the church, because Jesus' body was not divided. So what then? Death is robbed of its strength. And I love this. Athanasius talks about this for many pages. But it's a tyrant that's completely conquered, trampled underfoot. It's despised. Death is destroyed. Death is vanquished. Death is powerless. And I love that to hear that from someone so long ago that had this concept. Like, death, where's your sting? He wrote that like twice in this book. And so we see the effects of this. And so Athanasius says, we see martyrs unafraid to face death. Where does that come from? We see murderers who stop murdering. We see adulterers who stop adultery. Godless who become religious, and idolatry is destroyed, and the fraud of evil spirits exposed. So to Athanasius, I love this. It's like, it's just common sense. It's like, I see the power of God here. And then he says, those who disbelieve are simply ignorant and blinded to seeing the works that are right around us. It's right there. You can see the power of God. You know this is not man, right? So those are his main arguments. And then he addresses the Jews. He spends a little time, and I won't go into all that, but he talks about how the Bible from cover to cover, the Old Testament from cover to cover, has all these examples of what Jesus would be like, what would have to happen, and he quotes and talks about lots of those references. And then he talks to the Gentiles. So these would be the Greeks of the day. These would be those who are into all of the worldly philosophies and things. And they would talk about God, but he would be far off, and so what he would do is he said, it's not ridiculous to think that a God revealing himself in the universe would also appear in a human body to reveal himself. In other words, if God revealed himself at all, why would he not use a human body to reveal himself? That's not ridiculous. God didn't make a bigger display. Why not? Why didn't God do something huge? You ever thought about that? Athanasius says God's intent, he didn't have to make a big display because his intent was to heal and teach suffering men. Men, he says, were the only part of creation that had strayed and needed mending. I thought that was interesting. Men are the ones who God had to renew. They needed God's renewal. And so he came in a way to heal and teach suffering men. And again, he talks about the proof is in the effects. You see it. He talks about how they are attested by actual experience, he says. Demons are routed, oracles cease, magic and witchcraft are confounded, and murderers lay aside their cruelty. You can't learn these things from idols, he says. So I love all that. He gets to the end and he's talking about all of this, and then he says, examining the effects of the Incarnation. So he's talking about all the things that Jesus did as God came in a man. He says, examining the effects of the Incarnation is like counting waves of the sea. It's baffling. I think that's great. And then he says, and I love how he shows his heart a little bit, everything about it is marvelous. And wherever a man turns his gaze, he sees the Godhead of the Word and is smitten with awe. I love to hear that kind of heart from someone who lived so long ago and feel that connection to the early church. So that's really cool. So I'm kind of finished with my overview of the book, and I just pray that you would think about all this. I encourage you to meet Jesus for yourself. As Athanasius has written, Jesus made a way for us to turn from our road that leads to death. And so if you are on a road that leads to death and you see those effects, maybe you want to be made a new creation. So I encourage you to pray, seek the Lord, and He does this work as He comes in to us and we become His children.